In the grand theatre of global politics, it's easy to believe that countries are like actors, each with their own motivations and scripts. But what if there's a puppet master behind the scenes, pulling the strings and dictating the play? What if the decisions made by nations, especially those less powerful, are not entirely their own? This is the uncomfortable reality of geopolitical manipulation, a subtle and often insidious form of control where powerful nations like the USA exert their influence over others. It's not always about brute force or direct orders. Instead, it's about using a combination of economic pressure, military might, and political maneuvering to shape the destinies of other countries, often to serve their own interests. Think of it like this. Imagine a shopkeeper who only sells one brand of bread. The customers may have other choices in theory, but in reality they are stuck with what's available. This is how economic and military dominance can work. It limits the options available to other countries, subtly pushing them towards decisions that align with the interests of the more powerful nation. In the following sections, we'll pull back the curtain on these invisible strings of power, examining the tools and tactics used by the USA to maintain its global dominance. From economic coercion to military intervention, we'll explore how these methods have played out in the real world, often with devastating consequences for the nations on the receiving end. One of the most potent weapons in the US arsenal is economic coercion, a polite term for using financial pressure to get what it wants. This strategy is multifaceted and can be implemented in various ways, each with its own set of consequences. This can take many forms, from imposing crippling sanctions to manipulating trade agreements to favor American businesses. These measures are often justified as necessary for national security or to promote fair trade, but their impacts can be far-reaching and devastating. Sanctions, for instance, are like economic blockades. They restrict a country's access to international trade and finance, often severely impacting its economy and hurting ordinary citizens the most. The intention is to pressure the government into changing its policies, but the reality is that the common people bear the brunt of these actions. Iran, for example, has been under various US sanctions for decades, severely limiting its ability to sell oil, access foreign currency, or engage in international banking. These sanctions have crippled its economy, leading to widespread poverty and hardship. Then there are tariffs, which are essentially taxes on imported goods. By slapping hefty tariffs on products from specific countries, the US can make them more expensive, giving an advantage to American-made goods. This not only boosts the domestic economy, but also puts pressure on foreign competitors. This can hurt the targeted nation's industries and force them to make concessions to avoid economic hardship. The goal is to create a situation where the targeted country has no choice but to comply with US demands. Trade agreements, often touted as vehicles of free and fair trade, can also be tools of coercion. These agreements are often complex and filled with clauses that disproportionately benefit the US. The US has a long history of negotiating trade deals that benefit its corporations while putting developing countries at a disadvantage. These countries often find themselves trapped in agreements that limit their economic growth and sovereignty. These agreements can force nations to open their markets to American goods while offering little in return, creating an imbalance that favors the US, stifling local industries and increasing dependence on the US. This dependency can be long-lasting, making it difficult for these nations to develop their own robust economies. These are just a few examples of how economic coercion works. It's a subtle but powerful form of control that allows the US to exert its influence without firing a single shot, maintaining its global dominance through economic means, often leaving a trail of economic devastation and resentment in its wake. The long-term effects can be profound, altering the economic landscape of entire regions and fostering deep-seated animosity toward the US. The term free trade gets thrown around a lot in international relations, but the reality is often far from fair. The concept of free trade suggests an equal playing field where all parties benefit equally, especially when it comes to agreements pushed by the US. These agreements are often touted as mutually beneficial, but in reality they can be heavily skewed in favor of the US. These deals, while presented as mutually beneficial, can often be a way for the US to pry open markets, secure access to resources, and maintain its economic dominance. This dominance is not just about economic power, but also about political influence and control. By securing access to vital resources, the US ensures its industries remain competitive and its economy robust. One of the key tools in this strategy is intellectual property rights. These rights are often enshrined in trade agreements. US trade agreements often include strong protections for American patents and copyrights, ensuring that American companies can maintain their competitive edge, which can make it difficult and expensive for developing countries to access essential technologies and medicines. This not only affects their healthcare systems, but also stifles innovation, keeps prices high, and perpetuates dependence on US companies. The high cost of patented medicines can be prohibitive. Another tactic is using trade agreements to advance American geopolitical interests. These agreements are not just about economics. For instance, the US might offer favorable trade terms to countries that align with its foreign policy goals, effectively using economic incentives to buy influence and support. This strategy allows the US to build alliances and ensure that its geopolitical interests are protected. Conversely, it may threaten to withdraw trade benefits or impose sanctions on countries that challenge its interests, using economic leverage as a cudgel. This can have devastating effects on the economies of those countries, using economic leverage as a cudgel. The threat of sanctions or the withdrawal of trade benefits can force countries to comply with US demands. The Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a massive trade deal that the US negotiated but later withdrew from, is a prime example of this dynamic. The TPP was designed to create a large free trade zone, is a prime example of this dynamic. The TPP was widely criticized for prioritizing the interests of large corporations over those of workers and the environment. The TPP was widely criticized for prioritizing the interests of large corporations over those of workers and the environment, and for potentially undermining national sovereignty in favor of corporate tribunals. Critics argued that the deal would give too much power to multinational corporations and for potentially undermining national sovereignty in favor of corporate tribunals. These tribunals could override national laws and regulations. While the US ultimately pulled out of the TPP, it continues to pursue similar trade deals. These deals often include provisions that benefit American corporations at the expense of other countries' sovereignty and economic stability. It continues to pursue similar trade deals, often using its economic might to extract concessions and shape global trade rules in its favor. This approach ensures that the US remains at the center of global trade, often using its economic might to extract concessions and shape global trade rules in its favor. This uneven playing field perpetuates a system where the US benefits disproportionately. Often at the expense of developing countries struggling to find their footing in the global economy. These countries face significant challenges in competing with the economic might of the US, often at the expense of developing countries struggling to find their footing in the global economy. This imbalance creates a cycle of dependency and economic disparity that is difficult to break. While economic pressure can be a powerful tool, the US hasn't shied away from using its military might to achieve its geopolitical goals. Over the decades, the United States has engaged in numerous military interventions, each with its own set of justifications and consequences. These interventions have ranged from large-scale wars to smaller, more covert operations, all aimed at maintaining or expanding American influence around the globe. From full-scale invasions to covert operations, American military intervention has left an undeniable mark on the world stage. The US military's presence in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq has been particularly significant, with long-term deployments and extensive combat operations. These interventions have often been framed as efforts to combat terrorism, promote democracy, or protect human rights, but their outcomes have been mixed and often controversial. The US boasts a global network of military bases, with hundreds of thousands of troops stationed in countries across the globe. These bases serve as strategic points for rapid deployment and power projection, allowing the US to respond quickly to emerging threats or crises. The presence of these bases is a testament to America's commitment to maintaining its global dominance, but it also raises questions about sovereignty and the impact on local populations. This vast military presence allows the US to project its power rapidly and intervene in regional conflicts, often justifying its actions as promoting stability or combating terrorism. However, the reality on the ground is often more complex, with interventions sometimes exacerbating existing tensions and leading to unintended consequences. The Middle East in particular has seen significant US military involvement, with operations in countries like Syria, Libya and Yemen. However, critics argue that this military interventionism often serves to advance American interests, even if it means toppling governments, propping up dictators, or fueling instability in the process. Anti-war protests and political unrest have frequently followed US interventions, highlighting the contentious nature of these actions. The debate over the true motivations behind US military involvement continues to be a polarizing issue, both domestically and internationally. The US has a long history of interfering in the internal affairs of other nations, often with disastrous consequences for the people caught in the crossfire. Civilian casualties, destruction of infrastructure, and long-term social and economic disruption are common outcomes of these interventions. Historical footage of US actions in Vietnam, Central America, and more recently in the Middle East serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of military intervention. The 2003 invasion of Iraq is perhaps the most glaring example of this. Launched under the pretext of eliminating weapons of mass destruction, the invasion quickly turned into a protracted conflict with devastating consequences. The initial military success was followed by years of insurgency, sectarian violence and political instability, which have left a lasting impact on Iraq and the broader region. Based on false pretenses about weapons of mass destruction, the US-led invasion plunged Iraq into chaos, leading to hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths and the rise of extremist groups like ISIS. The power vacuum, created by the removal of Saddam Hussein's regime, allowed these groups to gain a foothold, further destabilizing the region and contributing to a cycle of violence and displacement that continues to this day. The war destabilized the entire region, creating a power vacuum that continues to have ripple effects today. The resulting instability has led to a humanitarian crisis, with millions of people displaced and seeking refuge in neighboring countries and beyond. The long-term effects of the Iraq War are still being felt as the region grapples with ongoing conflict and the challenge of rebuilding. Beyond large-scale interventions, the US also engages in covert operations, using special forces, drone strikes, and clandestine support for proxy militias to achieve its objectives without direct military engagement. These operations are often conducted in secrecy, with little public oversight or accountability. While they are presented as precise and targeted actions, they can also result in civilian casualties and further complicate the political landscape in the affected regions. These covert actions, often shrouded in secrecy and lacking accountability, raise serious concerns about transparency and the rule of law in international affairs. Whistleblowers and investigative journalists have occasionally brought these operations to light, sparking debates about the ethical and legal implications of such actions. The balance between national security and adherence to international law remains a contentious issue, with ongoing discussions about the need for greater oversight and accountability in military operations.